In 1969, Apollo 11 was the first manned mission to land on the moon. Or was it? In recent weeks, we've seen Tucker Carlson, Patrick Bet-David, and Joe Rogan and Bart Sibrel discuss conspiracy theories suggesting that the moon landing was a fake. It really pisses me off. NASA's the only thing we all should agree upon that's a net good for Americans and the whole world. In NASA's footage, you can clearly see the flag waving, even though there's no atmosphere in the moon. There are also no stars seen in the footage, and the radiation levels in the Van Allen radiation belts surrounding the Earth would have been lethal to the astronauts, since NASA had not developed adequate shielding technology to protect them back then. Right? Wrong. Usually I don't waste my time trying to debunk claims like these, because I don't think such people can be reasoned with. They're not interested in debate. They're interested in sensationalism. But in the recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience featuring notorious conspiracy theorist Bart Sibrel really compelled me to break that rule. Having people like Sibrel cast aspersions on NASA's credibility, historic achievements, and contributions to our safety every time we get on a plane just could not be left aside. That's why today I'm going to systematically debunk Sibrel's claims one by one, explaining the science behind the Apollo 11 mission, and extending an invitation to him to join me on the Joe Rogan Experience for a debate, one-on-one, mano-a-mano, with a real scientist. Let's go back to the moon. Some of the claims are so ridiculous that it's impossible to take Sibrel seriously. He keeps referring to electrical light. Electrical light. What the hell does that even mean?
It's electrical light, it's an electrical light, it's an electrical light by electrical light, an electrical light, proving it's an electrical light. It's an electrical light to electrical light. That electrical light, it looks like an electrical light. It can only be done with an electrical light. It's electrical light.
He doesn't even know the terminology of this field, and he's supposed to be a documentary filmmaker. The term is artificial light, or perhaps man-made light. But you're trying to debunk it. You don't even know the terminology. It's kind of pathetic. So instead of just dismissing it right at that, we're going to go through each and every one of these incredible, ridiculous claims that the moon landings were faked. For what purpose? He doesn't really give, except some nebulous things that he's heard from CIA agents and astronauts who he refuses to mention their names, because I guess he's worried about their safety after 50 years. He always says, I brought this footage, and these different channels like Fox News wouldn't even publish them because they were afraid that they would be shut down by the government. What, big NASA? You're going to have Buzz Aldrin come and stomp a mud hole on you? It's so ridiculous. But let's entertain it as if it's real. And I'm going to bring the science that Sibrel and unfortunately Joe Rogan were completely unwilling to entertain. Have a real scientist on, Joe. I've been on the show before. I gave you a moon rock, for God's sakes. I don't know. Did you smoke it? What'd you do with it, Joe? I even gave you a Mars rock. So the first of his ridiculous claims revolves around the angles of light and shadows on the moon, which is preposterous in many ways. The moon is a complex three-dimensional object. It's also in motion, and here's a depiction made by one of my kids. This is a 3D print of it. It's really cool, and it shows some of the major features, the difference between the light side and the dark side. But the fundamental evidence, quote-unquote, attempts to use this term like he's a scientist himself. The fundamental evidence is that the flag seems to be waving, which is a hoax because the wind doesn't exist on the moon's surface, right? Do you think NASA didn't know that? Do you really think that they could get even this rocket to go in space? I don't think Sibrel denies the fact that the rocket actually left the Earth's surface. And the astronauts were not only gone for more than a week off the Earth's surface, the cameras on Earth, independent countries around the world, our enemies like the Soviet Union and China were tracking this. They had everything to gain by denying what we did, but he has some, of course, explanation for why they would collude with their arch enemy. For what purpose? We don't know. It's not specified, but I guess if you're an expert, conspiracy crackpot, you have some ideas of your own. So there's no wind on the moon's surface, so how could the flag wave? NASA knew this. They installed wires inside the flag to suspend it, so it wouldn't just look like a draping, depleted, flaccid flag. So that's a ridiculous claim to be made. And the fact is, all the moon landings had this feature, so they'd all have to be faked in some sound studio, as Sibrel suggests. So the flag was fitted with a horizontal rod that kept it unfurled, extended. And the waving motion is due to vibrations caused by the astronauts. The surface is so still that objects can remain there for literally millions of years. undisturbed and untested. So any tiny perturbation will cause a great deal of motion. There's no inertia. There's no wind resistance to damp the motion as well. Once the motion started, it kept in position due to the lack of air resistance. This is trivial. This is freshman high school level stuff, Bart. Next, he has some ridiculous claims about the magnetic field of the Earth and that astronauts would be fried going through it in some sense, which is, again, preposterous. The Earth's magnetic field is far, far weaker at the moon's surface, so going to the moon would actually be safer if this preposterous claim were actually true. And if it were true, the astronauts that orbit around the Earth in the ISS, which you can see on almost any given night of the year, depending on where you are on the Earth's surface, they would be irradiated and they would suffer grave consequences unless every single one of the 700 or so astronauts that NASA alone has sent into space, not to mention the Chinese, the Russians, and many other countries as well, and partnership around the globe. It's one of the few areas of life that has cooperation. This is another reason I hate these debunkers and these supposed conspiracy theorists that talk about NASA in such a disparaging light. Again, we have very few examples of international cooperation. The next claim that Sibrel makes in the first few minutes of this clip, a link down below, is that there was a delay in the radio communication that led to suspicions. And he claims it's 12 seconds long, and that he claims shows signs of being tampered or edited or staged.
White crystals. And the thing that I reported as vesicular before, I don't believe I believe that anymore. I think it's small craters. They look like...
First of all, that proves nothing about the truth or falsehood of people landing on the moon's surface. And it's, of course, possible and it's mandatory for there to be a delay. In fact, it's only a delay of about 1.5 seconds each way, because that's the distance the moon is away, traveling at the speed of light, which is the speed the radio communications travel at. He seems totally ignorant about that. So there's a 3-second approximate round trip time delay, just that's built in, plus the comprehension delay, the time delay when the astronauts are working on the moon's surface for them to think about what they're going to say. And they had stuff that was, there were pre-written down scripts for them to say. Neil Armstrong obviously had a great deal of pressure thinking about what he would say when they first landed on the moon's surface. Tranquility Base, the Eagle has landed, which wasn't prompted from Houston. Houston being where the lunar missions were guided and serviced from the Earth. So this is completely a known phenomenon, and there's no reason to even expect that there wouldn't be a delay. It would be more suspicious if there wasn't a delay. And the delays are consistent between people in low Earth orbit or objects in geosynchronous orbit and then objects in lunar orbit. And he claims this is so ridiculous to believe because NASA hasn't been back. Well, the budget for the moon mission today is about 0.5%. Back in the 1960s, while we were fighting a war against the communist Soviet Union and China and proxy war in Vietnam, this was taking up like 8% of the American budget. So this is a huge, huge cost. And even now, the missions to go back will cost about $1 billion. I'd like to know how Mr. Sibrel would propose to do it in a cheaper fashion. And I'm sure it'd be just as safe and lose no astronauts. And further proof of the fact that it was so expensive and difficult is that there was an 18th mission planned and actually funded and scheduled and so forth throughout NASA. And they canceled it because of essentially lack of interest, even by Apollo 13, as the famous movie depicts. People lost interest in the lunar landings, even after 2 of the successful ones occurred. So let alone having another 6, 7, 8 more, 10 more, hundreds more, as Sibrel seems to suggest. And it was planned to be the mission of the space shuttle to kind of pave the way to go back to the moon. But I also want to point the fact out that we as a species, not me or NASA or anything, went to Antarctica and the South Pole in 1911, 1912. And the conquest of the South Pole was the exact equivalent of going to the moon, but some 50 years earlier. And it was a race for international pride and power and so forth. And even the exploration of the last continent on Earth didn't occur until the 20th century. Just again, 50 years before landing on the moon. So it's quite incredible. But the fact is, we never went back to Antarctica, to the South Pole, for another 50 years. It was almost just before the Apollo missions. This is actually before the Gemini missions in the late 1950s, when not astronauts, but explorers and scientists like me and my colleagues went back to the South Pole. So there's absolutely no reason to suggest that there's a conspiracy or cover-up, or it proves it was impossible because it took another 50 years and we still haven't gone back to the moon. That's exactly what happens in all phases of exploration. It's an incredible source of pride for the national governments and the explorers themselves, and they get to have their names in history. And then human interest is what it is, and people lose interest and it decays very rapidly. So turning from those three specious claims already been debunked thoroughly, I haven't even gotten to the most ridiculous evidence, which is his prime feature of evidence, which is the so-called intersecting shadows of light, which proves it has to be electrical light. Electrical light. It sounds so ridiculous, Bart. You should learn the terminology before you basically be clowning yourself on a stage as large as the Joe Rogan Experience. You can cover that up with claims of conspiracy and anything, but you can't cover up your own ignorance about the topic. You never show how it's possible to get converging shadows. And whenever you have somebody who only criticizes and doesn't seem to believe that there's any evidence that supports the moon landing, you have to be incredibly suspicious. So, of course, it made headlines around the world. Here's a copy from the New York Times. This is before I was born. It was gifted to me. And you see a picture of Neil Armstrong. Where the hell were they? And you look at things, and some of his claims are that, the shadows are at a right angle. Well, here's a very good picture showing the shadows are exactly in parallel as you'd see from the actual landing, even according to Sibrel himself. He never brings that up. He only brings up one picture, which is a very close-in shot, which you can't see the full panorama. You can't see the horizon. You have no peripheral view of it. This is just one image of it. And these were taken, this is immediately afterwards. All the shadows are consistent. The approach angle, the timing of the mission, thousands of hours of recording. This is original source material right here. This is very valuable. And it's something that to go back in time to recorrupt, this is on August 1st, 1969. So between August 1969 and July 20th, so it's just a couple of weeks later, they faked all this evidence according to Bart. It's so ludicrous, but it has to be pointed out that there are long known about lunatics that do propose these things. Now, also look at the shadows here. These are direct images. This would have to be staged in a conspiracy so expensive to go back and print these things later on. This is within less than 2 weeks after the moon landing itself. It's incredible. And the images show exactly what Bart himself claims you would see and that you don't see in one or two pictures. That's his prime evidence. Next, he talks about the lunar module and how it's designed and tested for the moon's lower gravity and the vacuum, and how they left a camera on the moon's surface to capture the ascent, the stage that where the Eagle itself is blasting back off to join Michael Collins, who is orbiting all by himself, the loneliest man in human history, 50 or 100 miles above the moon's surface. What the hell was he doing? How did he take pictures of them? They never went to the moon. Is it that they didn't land on the moon, so they flew all the way to the moon? They didn't get out of the moon capsule? These are just ridiculous. So the controlled camera from the Earth, they were able to do that. He talks about like a picture left by Gene Cernan, I believe, and they would have decayed. It's so preposterous. These are just like the most trivial things. Oh, they didn't know the temperature of the moon's surface, and they didn't know the variation of it, and it couldn't last. If you took a piece of plastic and left it on the moon's surface, what would happen, even if it was in a vacuum? I have photographic plates that I put into my laboratory vacuum chambers for exposure to different elements and radioactive materials. They last just fine, Bart. Totally ridiculous. In fact, sometimes cooling them stabilizes them. Here's a hint. Making it hotter and heating it up would destroy it faster. But they weren't destroyed, and it was videotaped. And if you went there, you could see it today. So there's a good thing. Hey there, truth seekers. Professor Brian Keating here with my tiny little homework assignment for you. And that's to make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel or follow me on your favorite podcast platform. After some thorough debunking of my own, I've discovered that only about half of you are subscribed or following the podcast on video or on YouTube. And it's a shame because I know you love what I'm doing and you want to come along for the ride and not miss anything. So don't wait. Do it today, right now, before it slips your mind. For some extra credit, like the video and leave a comment. Thanks a bunch. Now let's dive back deep into the debunk. Next, he talks about the destruction of equipment and tapes, as if this is, again, part of a vast conspiracy. Because you can't have a conspiracy, Bart, unless you have a cover-up, right? So this is another one of his controversial claims. NASA destroyed equipment. I don't know how NASA doesn't pursue this guy for slander, but it's public domain and so forth. So he claims that they destroyed the equipment and tapes to hide the evidence. That's a conspiracy. Remember, Nixon didn't get impeached because of the crime of Watergate, right, Bart? He got impeached because of the cover-up. So let's look for the cover-up. Oh, this proves a cover-up, the absence of archival footage. Okay, except those archives were actually processed, and the people that processed them and stored them and recovered them were on record for why they did what they did. They had to repurpose some of the telemetry tapes, but not the audio tapes. Those are still confined. In fact, just a few years ago in 2019, in July 2019, they had a replication of the lunar landing as if it was going on Twitter at the exact same time. So you had the audio recordings, you had the transcript of it. They didn't erase any of those at all, and especially from the first Apollo mission, which is the one that you should suspect most of all, right? If you're Bart Sibrel.
Houston, Tranquility Base. Do you have an updated limb weight for us, over?
That's affirmative. Stand by on the DAP. All right, DAP pad for you is limb weight 10906, over.
So this was standard practice at the time, even though it's of course true that way more recordings, photos, artifacts have been preserved and are kept under, tight lock and key, except for the fact that they're also available publicly if you have the right credentials, which obviously they wouldn't let Bart Sibrel near, because he tends to smear people like Edgar Mitchell, who's done more in his heroic life in a minute than Bart seems to have done, except for throw stones, lunar rocks at the Apollo achievements. For what purpose? I don't know. I'm not going to speculate the way that he does. Use your own judgment. So we have tons of samples brought back. They brought a rover there. And I haven't even gotten to the scientific proof. Stay tuned. We're going to get to some of the scientific proof that's incontrovertible, that can't be faked, because it's used to this day and is not only in the form of physical artifacts, it's in the form of scientific data. And no one would rather prove the prevailing narrative wrong more than a scientist. That's how we get our kicks as scientists, is proving that the prevailing wisdom, that Aristotle was wrong, that Newton was wrong, that Galileo was wrong, and even that Einstein could be wrong. And that is, in fact, impelling scientists, including my former colleague, Tom Murphy at UC San Diego, to study the position of the moon to millimeter accuracy. What does that have to do with the Apollo landings being faked? Stay tuned. Okay, so Sibrel goes back about 8 to 10 minutes into this clip of the conversation that I have posted down below.
If you type in moon landing fraud, you don't get anything about the fraud. You get 1,000 videos defending, the supposed moon missions. Now, if the moon missions are real, then anyone who says otherwise is an idiot.
He argues that the sheer number of videos defending the moon landing suggests that they were staged. This is a logical fallacy to say that the more people that defend or support a hypothesis tends to add to or detract from its veracity. So as Einstein said, when he was first being attacked by German scientists because he was Jewish, he was being attacked by German scientists saying that his theory of relativity was wrong. And they actually published a pamphlet or a book called 100 Scientists Against Einstein. And Einstein laughed about that. He said, if I was really wrong, it will only take one. And Galileo said a similar thing. The humble reasonings of a single man can overcome the depraved delusions of a maddening of crowds. There's tons and tons of videos and documentaries from the very minute, not even from the minute that it took off, from weeks before, interviews with the family members and visits to their home. And when they landed, they weren't permitted to go back into the public. They actually had to stay quarantined on the aircraft carrier, I think it was the Hornet, for 3 weeks. So can you imagine a week to get to the moon, a day or 3 or 4 days to get to the moon, a day on the moon's surface, and then later it was many, many days, a week, and then going back to the moon another week or half of a week, and then being quarantined. It's almost a month or more than a month of your life, constrained, confined to a space capsule or floating around in the ocean on an aircraft carrier. And these people were thought to have done that because of a great conspiracy. Okay, let's see what that says. So the ongoing public interest in it shows that it's actually more probable that it's a historical event, not a cover-up. You don't say that something didn't happen because there's so much evidence for it. And that's a strange form of logic. So I wonder if Bart believes that Kennedy was really assassinated. He probably believes in conspiracies about that, as is their wont. But he would have to deny that it took place because there's so much footage of it. There's a Zapruder film, other films, eyewitness testimony. Maybe it didn't happen because there's so much evidence for it happening. That's a strange form of logic. And again, there's something called the conspiracy number. If this purported hoax was truly a hoax, you would have to have the conspiracy involving not only the astronauts or a few people at NASA, thousands of people in the US government, not only them, their families. And to date, no one's come out and leaked about this. And yet there are people like Patrick Bet-David and Tucker Carlson and maybe even Joe Rogan who are willing to entertain these kind of depraved delusions that this didn't happen. And for what reason, we don't know. It's, to get a bigger budget for NASA, really? NASA's 0.5% of the US budget right now. And to say that it was a failure to go from 8% to 0.5% to dilute it by 16 times represents a grave failure and a miscalculation by these people in power. And yet they haven't come out and said, well, we were wrong. We thought we'd get a lot more money than we actually did. Now I want to turn to the scientific explanations, the actual hard evidence that effectively completely obliterates all of Bart's claims and affirms the authenticity of the moon landings. Not just the testimony of the astronauts and the NASA people and the military crew members that picked them up in the ocean and the impossible to account for missing month of their lives had this conspiracy actually been true. The actual hard data comes from scientists who, by their nature, will not participate in conspiracies willingly. So you'd have to trick all these US scientists. But wait, it's much worse than that. You'd have to trick our enemies, the Soviets, the Chinese, and others. You'd have to trick them into supporting via launching their own space missions and complementary data that confirms the methods and results found by the instruments placed on the lunar surface by Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and all the astronauts that came after, including Edgar Mitchell, who Bart disparages in this interview and says that he's threatening to have him whacked because he left a microphone illegally recording him, apparently when he had an interview with that great man who's responsible for so much of NASA science, but also he's also responsible for creating the sensation known as the overview effect, or popularizing that when he was in space, he realized the fragility of Earth and how it needs to be protected. And he famously said, I'd like to take every congressman up there, show him what I saw, and shake him by his collar and say, look at that, you effing son of a beep. Look at that. You have to protect that. Now, I guess that's a horrible thing, right, Bart? That such a person as Edgar Mitchell would do such a thing as want to convince the government to protect our planet. And this is long before, concerns about climate change or global warming, whatever your bugaboo is. I don't really care. But the fact is, the science done by these scientists, they sent up geologists, Cernan and others, to study the geology of the moon's surface and also to do tests that would enable us to test the theory of relativity on Earth. And these things make it incontrovertible that it actually occurred and that Sibrel, again, is not telling the truth. So in Apollo 12 and 15 and 16 mission, the lunar surface magnetometer was deployed. These were 3 different stations. They were consisting of what's called a triaxial flux gate magnetometer, which measures magnetic flux, which is the product of magnetic field times the area of these little solenoidal type shaped objects. And they're designed to measure the magnitude and temporal time variations of the lunar surface's magnetic field. There were 3 of these, as I said, landed in 3 separate Apollo missions, starting with the first one. The first one was very precious because they didn't actually know if they'd ever get back. If there was some moon virus that was left, on their clothing, and they brought it back, that would be incredibly unfortunate, and we'd probably never go back. And of course, they'd probably die, which they didn't, and they went on to live healthy, happy lives. And as I said earlier in many podcast conversations with my fellow professors, Neil Armstrong proves that being a professor is the best job on Earth because even after being the first human being in history to actually land on the moon's surface, he could only follow up that job by becoming a professor. So the analysis of the lunar samples brought back are also consistent with the magnetometer results by the LSR instruments that I just spoke about. So they brought back and they analyzed the magnetic field strength of the lunar surface. And they confirmed the results. So you have 2 powerful cross-checks. And other countries have done this as well. But the rocks confirm that the moon must have had a magnetic field. And in fact, it does have a magnetic field, but that magnetic field has changed over time. And the magnetic field behavior over the last 4+ billion years which was quite strong, and then fell down to a lower level. It's actually traced in the properties and the ages of the rocks that they actually discovered. So it started off very strong and then fell down to a region that's relatively small now, of 20 microtesla, apparently today. And that transition took about 800 million years. And so they can measure not only the magnetic field, not only the time in which it took place and how the magnetic field is now, but they can measure that over the entire surface of the moon. And it agrees in different regions that the astronauts never went to, the behavior of the magnetic field on the moon is totally visible and consistent with those data collected by the astronaut samples in the rocks that were brought back to Houston for analysis by, again, independent scientists, not NASA. I love people say, oh, big NASA. NASA's really doing this for their budgets. What the hell does this have to do with getting their budget? It's understanding fundamental geophysics and the behavior of our solar system. It's incredibly fascinating. Again, I'm furious about people like this who suggest that there's some big conspiracy to do that, when there's thousands of pieces of evidence that support it and almost no evidence supporting even the claim or hint that it didn't take place, other than some, again, a hoax theory or some other theory. As he states in the interview, Stanley Kubrick, who I'm, again, personally connected to through 2001: A Space Odyssey, which you can see behind me, the neon sign I have says "Open the Pod Bay Doors." That's because I'm the associate director of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, and that was the book on which 2001 is based that Stanley Kubrick directed. So the theory is that he used this. Again, he used electrical lights. Be careful, electrical lights. They're very scary and dangerous and conspiratorial sounding. The Apollo mission is actually followed up by an Apollo mission. And that stands for the Apache Point Observatory Lunar Laser Ranging Operation. And that's contributed significantly to our understanding of the Earth-Moon system. Now, this was co-led by my former colleague, Tom Murphy, since retired from UC San Diego. Hi, Tom, if you're out there. What Tom and his collaborators did is measure the moon's position to an accuracy of, as Tom used to describe it, less than the thickness of a paperclip. Okay? Not Operation Paperclip for those conspiracy theorists out there. And this is incredibly important, not only for understanding the Earth-Moon dynamics, but to test the properties of general relativity and look for things like extra dimensions and other modifications to the inverse square law of Isaac Newton. And this is a phenomenally fascinating endeavor. And so the astronauts left these lunar retroreflectors that no matter what angle they were at, as long as you had a clear view from the Earth's surface, you could shoot a burst, high-powered laser burst from the Earth to the retroreflector, and then you knew the exact time you shot this burst of photons back. Some of them would get through the atmosphere of the Earth as they left the telescope. So you use a telescope in reverse. It makes a very powerful collimated beam that can shoot directed energy to the moon, not to destroy it or kill off some aliens or maybe it was done to burn up the dummies and the stand-ins for the astronauts that Kubrick left on the moon's surface. But it's not done for that. No, it's done to measure gravity. So it's a tremendously noble pursuit. Again, these are people Bart is disparaging the intent, the honesty of scientists. There was no way to get these measurements other than the lunar retroreflectors, these mirrors, especially high-tech mirrors that were left on at least 2 or 3 different Apollo missions. Okay, so I haven't even gotten to the photographic evidence. Don't worry, we're going to get there in just a bit. And so these missions have been followed up for a variety of reasons to not only investigate the physics, the age, the chemistry of our solar system, but to measure things like gravity. It have nothing to do with national pride and so forth. It's understanding fundamental physics. Now, there have been other spacecraft that have orbited the moon, like the Chandrayaan-1 spacecraft from India, and the Lunar Atmosphere and Dust Environment Explorer, LADEE. They've mapped the moon's magnetic field from both low moon orbit, and they've done it on both the so-called light side that we can see and the dark side of the moon. Though there is no dark side, that's a misnomer. It's really maybe should be called the far side because the moon and the Earth are tidally locked together. We only see one face from the Earth's surface, but the other side of the moon gets illuminated half of the lunar month as well, just like the side that we can see. So these measurements provide invaluable assets to understand the magnetic environment and its interaction with the solar wind, because some of the properties of charges and dust can be affected by the impact of charged particles that leave the sun and get accelerated towards and affected by the moon's magnetic field. And that helps us understand space weather. By understanding space weather, we can perhaps prevent catastrophic events equivalent to electromagnetic pulses or Carrington events. We can mitigate some of the effects of those, maybe shutting off satellites in orbit or not launching astronauts in orbit to avoid burst of solar wind. So again, these are things that are so beneficial to not only the reputation of the scientists and astronauts at NASA, but to your life. And so you are being impugned by these individuals who, like Sibrel, who claim that the moon landings were a hoax. So again, this would only serve to demean and reduce the impact of NASA, which again gets less than 0.5%, 0.48% of the US budget. And that equates about $20 billion. That's going down every year lately. So it's horrible. They're going to have to shut off instruments like the Chandra X-ray Observatory if funding isn't acquired for it. And so the NASA budget's decreasing, and this person wants to see NASA fall even further. For what reason? Again, I don't get paid by NASA. I don't have any NASA contracts or grants. I've worked at NASA as an undergraduate in testing the delamination propensity of aircraft skin, which is another thing that NASA does for your public safety. So good job, Bart. Let's take away the budget so that we can have more airplanes rip apart their skin and have more people get injured. Hey there, last time. It's me back with a fantastic offer for you. Would you like to own a real piece of outer space? No, not the moon rock that I gave Joe Rogan and presumably it went up in some form of vapor, but actually a tangible piece of the early solar system, a meteorite, which is almost as good as this because this made a hole in a crater in the moon's surface, which was explored by the astronauts in Apollo 11. So all you have to do to get your chance to win one of these beauties is to go to briankeating.com/list and join up. And if you have a .edu email address and you live in the United States, you're automatically going to win one. So for you lucky students and faculty, go to briankeating.com/edu to enter. So beware, your local conspiracy theorists may not trust that it's real. Now back to the episode. Okay, so when you do these things, when you have cast aspersions on the work done by thousands of NASA scientists, engineers, and people that are supported by them, you actually make life on Earth and for travel and so forth less safe. So be careful when you do things like this. It's not a honorable trait, in my opinion. So understanding the impact of asteroids from understanding the crater dynamics on the moon's surface, mapping their magnetic field, again, how the magnetic field of the moon is impacted literally by these craters, helps us understand how often and what we could do to deflect asteroids and perhaps remove them from their dangerous orbits that could impact literally the Earth and, again, harm you. Lastly, I want to talk about some confirming evidence that comes not from the United States, not from big NASA, but from the Soviet Union. They launched a mission called Lunokhod, which meant Moonwalker. These are two different missions that were part of the Luna program. They also left retroreflectors on the moon's surface. And Tom Murphy and his colleagues in the Apollo Apache Point Lunar Laser Ranging Instrument in New Mexico, they also use those retroreflectors as additional data points for those studying the Earth-Moon system. Now, those were left by robots. The Soviets never made it to the moon. They still have it. And again, this would have to be some conspiracy that we can go to the moon, but the Soviets can't. No, they didn't want to go. They didn't care to go. After the U.S. beat them to it, they lost all the sense of national pride. So the Soviets have been there by sending robots there, but it agrees exactly with the instruments that were carried by Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong on the very first landed mission, Apollo 11. These all agree. And that's coming from an enemy of the United States back then. Now we're best friends with Russia, right? There's another mission from India, called the Chandrayaan-3, which also put a lunar retroreflectors down. Those agree exactly with the previous measurements that I've talked about. Again, you're measuring the distance of the moon to the width of a fingernail or paperclip. It's incredible. And so to think that these are all done in some huge conspiracy lasting over 50 years, half a century, involving scientists that study general relativity, magnetic fields, cosmic rays, solar wind, it becomes preposterous. And lastly, we're planning now to go to the moon via the Artemis missions, and hopefully past guest and friend of the channel, Jessica Meir, she will be the first woman to land on the moon's surface by 2030. It keeps getting delayed. These will be billion-dollar plus missions every time they go up. So that shows you, again, it's so expensive. That's 5% of NASA's budget for every mission. And they want to make sure they're safe. So they're using the technology, the landing developed by NASA in the 1960s to get there. and further proven out through the actual or missions to the moon that included everything from Apollo 11 to Apollo 17 with the absence of Apollo 13. Again, that would have to be staged, that they had some accident, that they blew off the oxygen circulator as depicted in the great movie, and that they didn't go there, even though they did launch, and most of the cost is in the launch and recovery, not in the actual expedition on the moon's surface. That's just, once they get there, they already have those resources launched into space. So that had to be fake too, by the way, Bart, in order to have consistency that this whole thing, and again, for what purpose? To get some huge budget when their budget's gone down? Does that make any sense to anyone out there? I'm serious. Leave a comment down below if you're more persuaded by Bart. And then lastly, I haven't really even gotten to the photographic evidence. So as Groucho Marx said when he was caught sleeping, around in some movie, and his wife comes in the movie and he says, "Who are you going to trust? Me or your lying eyes?" So we're going to show you some pictures that were taken, not by the, I don't want to, be too much of a cheerleader for NASA. I'm going to show you pictures taken by the Indian spacecraft that orbit around. And there's equivalent pictures that have been taken by Chinese scientists and their spacecraft that have orbited around, and of course by the Soviet Union. And actually you have seen it from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO. That's also been used to take images of the landing sites themselves. And everything agrees. The positions of the craters, where the spacecraft is, the debris left behind once the ascent module took off from the surface. All these would have to be done in conspiracy. For what purpose? And the best evidence that this Mr. Sibrel has is electrical lights. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that the evidence is overwhelming. And when I hear people like past guest Patrick Bet-David, and I hear people like Tucker Carlson, who never be a guest, but when I hear them speak about it, like they're open to anything, like the government lied to me once, so I'm never going to trust the government ever again. That's infantile. You should trust that which you have evidence for. And you should believe things that you want to have faith in. So you can believe in a supernatural beings or gods or saviors, lords, whatever you like. That is based on belief. But when you have facts that can be checked and disproven by other facts, then that is science. And you should trust that which you have evidence for. You may have belief for stuff. You may have a desire to want to portray a narrative for financial purposes, for whatever purposes you like. But you can't say that you're entitled to your own facts. No, there's one set of facts in nature. We try to do it. And nothing makes scientists more excited than disproving other scientists. Okay, we're very competitive. It's a zero-sum game in science where you only can get so much funding for certain things. And you want to test and hopefully maybe find a flaw in our understanding as before. So I'm going to have copious amounts of data down below, links to follow-up material, images you can find yourself. And none of this involved, eyewitness testimony and so forth, but it's a lot more convincing to a real scientist like me and many of you out there than the claims of some shadows that could have been produced by electrical lighting. Look, by the way, Bart, if you want to show that, set up the diagram of how that would look, how you would actually reproduce it, and the colors of the moon's surface. By the way, I gave Joe a piece of the moon's surface that looks a lot like this, and they were talking in the show about color-corrected video, and that is Bart's expertise, right? He's a filmmaker, not a scientist. He even says that himself. And he says, it's caramel and it's gray. There's many different interactions between the moon's surface, its reflectance, and the amount of light that gets produced. And we see light in different colors back on the Earth due to Earthshine, where light bounces from the sun off of the Earth to the moon, back to the Earth. And we can measure the albedo, which is the reflectance. And the albedo, Bart, I have to tell you, is chromatic. It has different dependence on color, so different wavelengths of it can depict at different times. And perhaps they color corrected at one time, they didn't color correct at another time. But you still haven't provided any evidence for why that shouldn't be the case, that it shouldn't have different colors. This thing has specks of caramel color, of gray, of white, of crystal. This is a fragment of the moon's surface that was blasted off the moon's surface by a meteorite, which crashed on the moon's surface instead of hitting the Earth, pulverized the crust surface of the moon, and then after millions of years perhaps orbiting around the Earth, eventually landed in Africa, collected, and then I bought it on the internet. And it has the same surface chemistry properties as measured by spectroscopic measurements. You don't even have to trust the Apollo mission. You can trust the crust measurements of the composition based on spectroscopy from literally thousands of astronomers, astrophysicists around the world. But you should also trust the Apollo return samples, because that's firsthand evidence, if you will, and there's almost nothing better than that, rather than it's pure speculation that the moon landing was faked. For what purpose? By Stanley Kubrick, who never attested to the fact that he did that, so he had to have a cover-up. His family had a cover-up. So Bart, the offer stands. If you'd like to go back on Joe Rogan, he'll have us both back on. I'll bring in samples. You can examine them, and we can debate it. You can even have your own, as I said, you can have your own theory. You can't have your own facts, my friend. So I hope you enjoyed this debunking video. It was requested by whopping almost 1,000 people on the channel in the community section. Stay tuned. If you're interested in more videos like this, let me know in the comments down below. Who knows? Maybe I'll do more. Thanks a lot, Brian Keating. You made it all the way to the end. I know you're going to love this interview I did with lifelong moon enthusiast and expert Rebecca Boyle. And click here for a playlist of the best episodes from the past few weeks. See you next time on Into the Impossible.